I absolutely love watercolor pencils, and they are by far my favorite material. As someone who grew up drawing, I love that the pencils give me a whole lot of control, and I can draw and shade with them just like a regular pencil. But when I add water, that's when the magic happens, and I can get rich painterly effects very easily with the pencils. And watercolor pencils are perfect for mixed media when you're layering them with other materials like watercolor paint, ink, collage, and so much more. Though there are a number of techniques for using watercolor pencils, I tend to use one very simple and very basic technique most of the time, but I put my own spin on it. So I want to share that one technique with you along with a couple of variations so that you too can get rich layers in your mixed media work or in your visual journal. So here it is. Activating with water. Like I said, this is probably one of the most basic and ordinary watercolor pencil techniques that you can use. And in a nutshell, you simply color and shade the pencil down onto the paper, and then you paint over it with plain water, allowing the color to spread. It's the water that gives you that nice painterly look. But I use this technique in a slightly different way. I really like working the pencil into the negative space. See, typically we think of coloring or shading in the shapes that we're creating. So we put the color inside of the shape. Or if you want to get a bit more technical, we fill in the positive space. That gives us a blue square or a red circle. But I like to work around the shape in the negative space. So this technique is very similar to negative space painting, where shapes or letters or objects are defined mostly by painting around them. Sometimes I draw the shape in beforehand with pencil or pen, but oftentimes I just take the watercolor pencil and begin drawing and shading, and I create the shape as I go. Now, I mostly use simple geometric shapes, and squares, rectangles, and circles are my favorites. But it works well with any shape. And I've used it around stenciled letters and even around recognizable objects like faces, figures, and still life objects. It just takes a little bit more patience when working with those more complex shapes and objects. So the technique begins by putting down a lot of pigment. So I apply quite a bit of pressure and I shade darker near the shape. And as I move further away from the shape, further into that negative space, I lighten up my pressure and I allow the value to get lighter. This is like regular shading with pencil, but I'm not as neat and tidy with it as I would be if I were shading with graphite or regular colored pencil. So anyway, I continue shading around the whole shape so that the shape is left empty and there's a color all around the outside of the shape in the negative space. If I have multiple shapes, I usually shade around all of them before I start adding the water. After I'm done shading, I paint plain water over the pencil and I allow the value to fade out into the background. Now, there are a couple different ways of doing this. First, I can start painting water into the negative space where there is no watercolor pencil and then work in toward the shape. This allows the darker values to mix and blend into the lighter values, and that's going to allow for that gradual value change. But I can also start with the darkest value and paint the water out away from the shape. But then I have a lot of pigment on my brush. So after working the color out a bit, I need to dip the brush into the water to dilute that pigment, and then I can paint a little bit more. But then I have to repeat that. I have to dip the brush into the water again and then paint some more. And I keep doing this until I'm basically painting with clean water. So the value of the color should fade as I get further away from the shape. Now, with both approaches, I still might have to go back and do a little blending to get a smooth transition of value. So that's the basic technique. Now for a couple of variations. Activating with watercolor paint. So here's the first variation on that very basic technique. It uses watercolor paint instead of plain water. So everything starts off exactly the same way. I shade with the pencil around the shape, but then when I'm ready to activate the pencil, I have to use some watercolor paint. Now I want to choose a contrasting color, and this is where my color mixing knowledge comes in, because certain color combinations are going to give me some muddy colors. So if I picked complementary colors like blue and orange, I'm going to get some muddy browns. And to be honest, I don't really like that. I want my colors to be nice and bright. Also, don't pick the exact same color. Blue watercolor pencil plus blue watercolor paint is just going to give you blue. And that's not very interesting at all. Now, one thing different with this technique is that as I am painting, I'm picking up some of that watercolor pencil and it's getting into my brush. So if I don't rinse it out when I get more paint, I'm going to contaminate my paint, especially light colors like yellow. So I'm always trying to keep my paints clean. So this is a great way to quickly get some color variety in my work. Layering. When I think about layering, I think about it in a couple of ways. I can layer just watercolor pencil, one color on top of another, and get some really interesting color combinations and some color variation. Or I can layer watercolor pencil on top of other materials like paint or collage. So let's take a look at layering just the watercolor pencil. I typically start with a light color, and I create my shape and paint the water over the pencil just like I usually do. But I have to let it dry. Of course, I can use a hair dryer or a heat gun to speed up the process. And then I take a slightly darker color and I repeat the process. That darker color is going to define the shape a little bit more. I let that layer dry, and then I can use an even darker color and add another layer on top of that. But you've got to be careful though. See, when you build up so many layers, it can build up a lot of pigment, especially in the darker areas. And some of those later layers might not stick well because of that buildup. They'll just kind of slide right off. Now, an alternative way to layer the pencil is to begin the exact same way with a light color, and then when layering on the other colors, instead of sticking to the original shapes, I overlap with new shapes. Now, I'll have some areas that have several layers of colors in them and some that have none at all. It's just another variation to try. Now, let's take a look at layering on top of other materials. I often use the basic technique to get blank pages started, but I probably use it even more to layer on top of other materials. This helps me create those rich layers of mixed media that I'm after. So I can start with collage. Maybe I glue down some craft paper, and then after giving the glue a little bit of time to dry, I can paint some watercolor over top of it. Now, a quick note about glue. Some folks use acrylic medium or Mod Podge as a glue, and that's fine. But it's not going to work really well with watercolor paint and watercolor pencil. The medium and the Mod Podge, it's going to resist the watercolor since these materials create a waterproof layer on the paper. They're great for acrylic paints, but not so great for watercolor. Now I use a good glue stick, and I only apply it to the back of the collage. So anyway, after the watercolor dries on top of the collage, I can draw in some lines and shapes with a waterproof pen. I can then use these lines and shapes for places to layer the watercolor pencil. So I shade the color around the shapes and alongside the lines, and then I paint water over the pencil just like I've done before. And this allows the color to fade into the rest of the page, and it kind of creates a nice window effect with the shapes that I made. So this is only one simple way to layer a few materials, but it still gives me some richness on my page. Now, by layering multiple watercolor techniques or multiple materials or multiple colors or multiple watercolor pencils, it's really going to ramp up the color and the textures, and it's going to give me a lot more richness. And so there it is, my favorite material and probably my favorite all-time technique. Though it's pretty basic, using it in all of its variations can lead to some really interesting mixed media pieces or journal pages. So give it a try and see what you can do with it. So I hope that you enjoyed this look at one of my favorite techniques. And if you got something out of this video, something useful, please hit that like button. And if you don't want to miss out on more things like this, make sure to subscribe. And please share this video with any of your friends or any artistic accomplices that might like it too. Until next time, happy creating.